dive right in. So art making and sustainability, I don't know. I feel like it's something that within our team we're still talking, asking questions about. None of our, no, actually that's not true. Generally, none of our work kind of directly speak about the topic of the environment or sustainability. So yeah, so I'll share a bit more about the one project, which is very much in progress, in process. But to start with, I think like what art making in this context, I'd like to propose art making as expression, as work, whether it's something that you get paid for or don't get paid for. And art making as an occupation is something that people do, that we do with different parts of our bodies. And sustainability as meeting our needs and our ambitions. And not just ours, but like who else, right? And what are we sustaining? What are these kinds of needs? Is it the need for air? Is it the need for food? Is it the need for a non-polluted area to sleep in? Is it a need to sustain different livelihoods or cultures? Or yeah. So I think we can move on to the next slide. This is just a quick one. So Bernice Lee and I, she's a dance artist as well, so we started Daring Do Dance. And the Rolypoly Family is where we work with children and families through dance, and then Body Movement Art is the program through which we talk about safety and sexuality education. So Bernice, Isha, and I work closely across all these areas. Yes, was that what I was going to say? Absolutely. Okay, moving on. Thank you. So, yeah, we move a lot, we dance a lot with children, and as mentioned, like families. We also move around with teachers, with educators and such. So we're facilitating mostly movement to happen, even if maybe movement feels like it's not there at that point in time. So we facilitate that and facilitate the creativity. Sometimes we meet people who say, I'm not creative, or like, I can't dance, I don't move. So then the process of finding ways to structure it so that we can tap into that. And relationships. So movement creativity and relationships as generative resources. Wow, it's really hard to talk with this. But hang on. Okay, I'm just loosen this up a bit. So I don't know if generative resources is sort of like a phrase that people use. But just thinking of how when we move, like movement can beget movement, like movement can generate more movement. Creativity, when I suppose when there's room for it, when we feel safe and liberated to create, that creativity can beget more creativity. And then within this context of moving and creating with each other, that potentially there could be new types of relationships that are generated. For example, when we work with children and their family members, like adults, the power shifts between the children and their parents in a way, like who is feeding, who's following, and then also with teachers, in the space. Can we give up the responsibility of safety, perhaps to the children in some instances? So generating new kinds of relationships as well. And that, yeah, maybe, this is something that as we practice more, we get more of. And yeah, moving on. You're doing it for me. Okay, so this is context improvisation. I don't know, you can look it up. I think it's also another way of playing, of being together, of practicing relationship communication. that is very much body-based and to get more and more. So yeah, if you look it up, I'm not going to talk too much about it. So yeah, in a sort of more like practical way, for us within our work and the logistics of our work, the like day-to-day, we try to create works that are very portable and adaptable, so that we don't literally go in with a lot of stuff, or like the need to transport a lot of stuff and all that. And in a way, we can look at the environment and the group or the context of the place that we're at, and then try to meet that, fit ourselves in kind of literally, into the spaces. So this is one of our shows called Let Us Come Alive, and there's a version called our agency as well. So we take to different spaces. So yes, I think that's all I was going to say. Move on. So Dance Jungle is another one of these formats for which we can kind of put together, show up at a stage and facilitate movement, and the practice of being together. So for this though, there's also a lot of practice about, noticing the environment around us and realizing the impact of, for example, an arm that swings this way. Like, who is there? Or if I was running, what's the impact of the energy level, the temperature of the space? If like 5 of us are gonna run, what's the energy impact on the rest of us? How do people feel? And then transforming and repurposing the material. There's the adaptation feeling as well. But also very, very literally, when we start a new project and we have to collect materials for props and things, or craft materials for certain workshops and things. Maybe some of you know this, maybe some of you don't. It's called Art.Throw. It's a Facebook page that's really awesome for gathering materials or sharing materials. So pretty much all our materials come from Art.Throw. It does require the coordination online as well as the logistics of gathering in sort of maybe more messy ways. More messy than ordering on, I don't know, what people use, Lazada or like going to a shop, right? But then that's where it's generative of relationships as well. Building relationships across communities and people. So the Prop Collective is new. I just doing a random shout out for them. I'm so sorry. I should have like this out. Okay, but anyway. One of the things that they're doing now, besides rotating props, which you can look up online and see their talents as they call them. But I saw that they just released a workshop for people to learn how to make props that can be used, I think, over time, like more. Yeah, so interesting stuff that they're doing there. So the Rolling On Artist Residency started sort of at the start of the pandemic because we were actually with another dance company putting on a show called Rolling On for arts in your neighborhood. And then at that time, it was like, oh, should we shut the show down? Should we not shut the show down? How do we make these decisions? What's the impact of it? And so I think there was a lot of push within, I think, our community of art workers being like, no, we try to get the show to go on, the show must go on and such. And then at the same time, we're like, what's the impact of that? What if people get more sick? Like, who will have to suffer the brunt of that kind of decision? Right? So these were just things that we're considering, and then we evolved the project into Rolling On Artist Residency next week. Invited in 2 artists through a fundraiser. Some of the money left over from the Arts in Your Neighborhood project, we rolled it into this worlds. Ela created a sort of comic book narrative, talk about a child who woke up and found that their world had changed. So with the through line of the comic book, he worked with 3 families, and the children were discovering how to make new worlds with the narrative, but also, with the family members, they got some instructions and materials for growing, for creating out of what they have in their spaces. So Rolling On Artist Residency is still, we're still trying to figure it out. We don't know. I mean, so if you have ideas, you can come to us. Things like these. So this is one of the events we held online. What does the snail say to the plant? We invited in Nova from Cultivate Central, as well as Dr. Ang, who's a biologist, local guy, but he's in Australia right now. And so we have conversations around, the movement and all, but we have conversations around interconnectedness and the idea of pests and how in the ecosystem of what we do and the impact of it, can we really call some bugs pests? Do we remove them because we don't like them, or they cause diseases and such? Or are there other ways where we recognize their value and that we don't center ourselves as humans and say, okay, you're a terrible bug because you're eating my seed, which was how I approached it at the start. But we were talking about then, how do we maybe even provide other plants that the bugs like, so that we redirect their movement, and then maybe we can find a balance for all plants. I think these themes will be framed better and in a way that's more understandable. Over to you, Disha.
Is this okay? Okay. So I'm going to use Faye's point on the bug and the pests essentially to talk about regenerative relationships. So when you think about how the way that the relationship we have with nature has become very much one that exists and works in our favor as human beings. And this is basically the anthropomorphic school of thought, right? That human beings are at the center of everything. And to begin to repair that relationship with the environment and to address the implications of the climate crisis, we need to be regenerative in those relationships. So it's really about, I'm going to be abstracting part of it, but I will try to use examples as much as possible. But how can we repair our relationship with the environment and repair our relationships with other people? So this is in terms of the kind of inequality or the lack of equity that we currently inhabit, and how the climate crisis therefore doesn't affect people equally across the board. So next slide, please. So this is basically an intersectional framing of the climate emergency, and I think will be quite useful across the board because, and I think this point was mentioned earlier, but there are many aspects that contribute to the climate crisis, and we tend to think of these as environmental externalities only, but they manifest across the board. And in the area that I work most closely with would be wage labor. So basically the labor, the repercussions on labor as caused by the climate crisis. So an important point, framing point to remember is that we are not all equally positioned to mitigate the climate crisis in the same way that we are not all equally affected by the climate crisis. And this leads to bigger questions of then how do we hold people in power accountable for what they are doing about the climate crisis, and how do we navigate our position in this whole social order. So who has power and who is made vulnerable are two big questions. Next one, please. So I took this screen grab from Parasite, which I think was quite a popular movie 2 years ago, just to serve as a metaphor for how people are not equally, don't bear the externalities of climate change equally. So you have the rich lady here who's being chauffeured around, and she finds that the erratic weather, so the rain, serves her, is useful for her, because it means that the air is a bit clearer. But then you also have to think about who are the people that are responsible for pollution like this. Are they vulnerable communities, or are they oil companies that wealthy people invest in? And then at the bottom you have people who, for whom rain is destruction of property that is not easily replaceable, rain as loss of income, and how, so this is just a very stark comparison of how there really is no such thing as, like, and I guess it's quite cryptic to say, but like all of us are in this together, because we are really not. Yeah, so I wanted to talk about the culture of work and labor a little bit. So if we think about, so two crises at the moment would be the climate crisis as well as the pandemic. And when we think about the climate crisis, an example I wanted to give was that, so if you think about erratic weather and you think about how that affects work outdoors. So for example, people who work outdoors most of the time are migrant construction laborers. So if you have erratic weather for a couple of days, they're unable to complete their projects like outside. So that means that project is put on hold. When weather is finally good, they are basically pressured by the employers, who are pressured by other people to complete projects on time. So they end up being overworked. That means there's the overlooking of safety at the workplace. People get injured, people get ill, and this might lead to further loss of income for the worker, in some cases loss of life, in other cases a permanent injury that they live with. So that sort of externality of climate change is not made very often, that climate crisis equals loss of a job. And on the other hand, if we think about the pandemic as a crisis, so Faye was talking about the ROAR, like the Rolling On Artist Residency, and thinking about shows and how do we continue to engage with our audience in a time where you can only have 5 people or 8 people at a time, and having to put off shows, having to think about money that, like the financial cost to us as well as social costs to people. And when we think about these two things and we think about this idea of the crisis, it's always profit over planet, profit over people, and that is the way we have to make our decisions, which is what's gotten us here in the first place. But coming back to the point on the regenerative relationship, it's about the reverse. It's people over profit and planet over profit. I wanted to put this here because I think this relates very directly to art making. So I like this because of the realizable utopia. So we tend to think of utopia as something that is really just it exists in our imagination or it exists in fiction. But I like that this was framed as a realizable utopia because it tells us that change is not just reached through legislation or it's not just reached through policy. But as artists, we have responsibility to move towards that kind of change. And this is writing, speaking, dancing, and basically building and imagining equitable futures into existence. Right, so this slide basically links back to what we do at Rolypoly Family, which is basically centering the agency of children and children as empowered beings. So the key words, or the key ideas I wanted to focus on here was growth and new community. So growth, community, and change. So this is from Parable of the Sow. I don't know if anyone has read it, but it's supposed to be climate dystopia. But it's basically what's happening to us now, so I would call it climate reality. And the main character constantly repeats this line, all that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. And I think this strikes like a very delicate balance between human agency as well as like collective action, but also recentering the environment and recentering the climate. So it's a fundamental tool in emergent strategy, which is I think what a lot of activists or leftist like thinkers like to use. And it's also another useful tool when thinking about how we can use our art to make a difference. And so the last two slides are just two questions that I wanted to present to everybody as a way to start thinking about your artwork or your art practice. So the first one is about representing narratives about sustainability and the climate emergency. So this is about thinking about dominant narratives that currently exist, and these are usually dominant narratives that are peddled by power. So we can actually think about like the Uniqlo video that we just watched, and I'm going to give a critical perspective on it, in no way to diminish the great work Uniqlo is doing. But when you think about that narrative that is being framed in that case, Uniqlo is, I just googled this, Uniqlo earns 8 billion USD in revenue. But if you consider the kind of message that they put out, it individualizes the narrative of climate change a lot. So it's always about use less plastic straws, shop secondhand, and of course all these things help. But what about these major multinational corporations that produce so much pollution, or like the state that invests in Shell, continues to do that, but then tells us that we need more parts because, the climate is changing. So, like, how do we think about these dominant narratives, and how do we subvert them as artists in order to bring about the kind of equitable future we are looking at? And the second question is, how do we create our own worlds when this one ceases to exist? So this is a bit more, I think, related to performance, visual art, or climate fiction. And it also links back to something Faye was talking about earlier. So how do we imagine the end of this world? Not just the end of this world physically, but the end of the world as we know it ideologically. So new narratives, new policy, new kinds of political affiliation that we can imagine. I think that's it. Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah, I mean, this is just something I got from the Wikipedia about the state about telling stories. So making art and telling stories, and how ultimately it's about affect, it's about making people feel so that people will do. Yeah, thank you.